So I'd like to talk today about what EFSA means when they refer to methodological limitations in human intervention studies. What exactly does this mean?
It's clumsy wording, methodological limitations. It's EFSA speak for quality issues around the delivery of a study, Shawnee, and I think they're often good clinical practice related issues. So we see these words in many of EFSA's published negative opinions, and sometimes in the positive opinions as well. And we need to think of them as weaknesses. It's rare, if not impossible, to find the perfect human intervention study, clinical study. There is no such thing as a perfect study. But if a study starts to accumulate these weaknesses, these methodological limitations, it can fatally undermine the study in the eyes of the regulator.
So can you give me some examples maybe of what some of these methodological limitations can be?
Yeah, so I mean, let's put aside the obvious one of statistics, which is a big focus of some of these limitations and for EFSA opinions, because I think we're going to cover that in one of our other discussions, but we can give some examples. So let's take, for instance, randomization and blinding. How you allocate trial subjects to their respective intervention groups, especially when there's more than one group, is as in a comparator study, is through this process of randomization, random allocation. And it should ensure that there's balance between the groups at baseline and should prevent bias. And usually it's a predetermined list that we create, and it's important that any randomization procedure is secure and kept locked, and the details of that are securely kept away.
I suppose I've seen several claims where the lack of information on the randomization process has been enough to discredit the study within the dossier. And then I think there's been a couple of opinions where the groups were unbalanced at baseline. So I suppose these imbalances can suggest either an inadequate sample size or a failure of the randomization.
Now, EFSA's guidance clearly indicates that there's a hierarchy for human intervention studies, and I think we know that randomized controlled trials are the top of that hierarchy. So open label studies which don't have a comparator are usually discounted, or that they're going to count a lot less towards any proof of evidence of a claim, unless they're in a large package, but they'll usually be discounted by EFSA.
I do remember an unsuccessful 2019 opinion. It was a kidney bean extract for weight loss, and the dossier did include 3 uncontrolled single-arm studies. And even without reviewing in any detail, EFSA considered that no conclusions could be drawn from them, and they were, I suppose, put aside within the overall review of the dossier. So that's one example of an unsuccessful opinion. But then we've seen it come up even with the successful opinions. So there was a 2021 opinion on green kiwi fruit and normal defecation. I can't remember how many there were, but a couple of single-arm uncontrolled studies in that dossier, and they weren't considered as part of the overall. So I suppose it doesn't matter if these studies are demonstrating significant effects or not. They're simply just not considered by EFSA. They're put aside as part of the overall review. Are there any potential limitations in relation to population selection?
Oh, absolutely, for sure. I mean, the whole target of the EFSA health claims legislation, I suppose, is the general population and technically the maintenance of health in that population. So inappropriate population selection, and by that I usually mean patients or subjects who are on a kind of pharmacological intervention. Studies in those populations are only going to be useful in exceptional circumstances for proving of a health claim at least. And in those cases, EFSA puts the responsibility on you as the applicant to prove why it's relevant to use such a population. But I think if you go even further than that and you do include, as I was suggesting there, pharmacological intervention, some sort of drug therapy in your target population, then that's usually a step too far. And I really advise people not to go that far.
Yes, I know there was a couple of examples of joint mobility claims where patients with arthritis were included. And again, EFSA rejected these straight away without any further consideration. What about, let's say, something like blood glucose control? Obviously, it wouldn't be appropriate to include a type 1 diabetic population because, as you've highlighted, pharmacological medications are not acceptable. But would it be acceptable to include perhaps a type 2 diabetic population?
In some circumstances, it might be, and I use that might, maybe, possibly. If it was, for instance, very early diagnosed subjects who were as yet non-medicated, somebody in that pathway would often, eventually get onto metformin. But if they were early stage, just been diagnosed, but it's still the responsibility of the applicant to then say why that data would be relevant to the general population and maintenance of health. So it might be safer, for instance, to use a pre-diabetic population, who I think are still considered to be part of that general population. And I guess, Shawnee, there are plenty of other methodological limitations that we could discuss, but I always think that the best source of review for people is to say, go and take a look at some of the published opinions of EFSA, say over just the last 5 years, and you'll find this phrasing, these methodological limitations, popping up, regularly in their published opinions.